Hello, and welcome back to PBH435, Health Studies of Dangerous Drugs. Today we're going to be talking about drug policy, or our attempts to regulate and control drug use and manufacturing here in the United States. We'll start by discussing how the reform movement in the U.S. and social concerns related to drug use were the prime motivators towards U.S. drug regulation. We're also going to talk about some major pieces of federal drug policy and what the purposes of those pieces of legislation are and the influences that led to their creation. We're going to talk through the history of legislation on opioids, cocaine, marijuana, and other controlled substances. And then we're going to talk about our modern categories for controlled substances, and that's Schedules 1 through 5. We're going to talk a little bit about mandatory minimum sentencing. Of course, the penalties for drug trafficking, creation, and use are an important part of drug policy. And then we're going to talk a bit about testing and how, because this is important to regulation because this is often how drug use can be established. And then finally, we're going to talk about the budgetary effects of drug control efforts and also its effects on our relations with other countries and our criminal justice system. Throughout our lecture today, we're going to be talking about two different classes of drug laws. All the laws that we'll discuss break down into one of these categories. The first category is the regulation of legal drugs. These are laws that apply to people who manufacture prescription drugs, those who dispense them, and the physicians who prescribe them. So these are all drugs that are legal to manufacture and consume here in the United States. Our other category are those illicit drugs, the drugs that are now associated with criminal behavior, and these laws in this category regulate or outlaw the use, possession, and sales of these sorts of drugs. Now, when we look at where these regulations started, it's important to realize that at the beginning of the 1800s or the 19th century here in the United States, there was virtually no legislation regarding the use of any type of drug here in the United States. No age requirements, no manufacturing standards, no laws for prescriptions, none of it. Basically, if you wanted to put together a medication, cook it up in your backyard, call it an elixir or a tonic, and tell people that it would cure their headaches or restore their hair or basically anything that you wanted, there were no laws or restrictions against you doing that. Now, if you prepared that medication and sold it, and it ended up being dangerous or hazardous to people's health, there are really no restrictions against that either. So you might lose customers and you might have people who are angry with you, but it was not illegal because there were no laws governing that type of drug manufacturing. So as we look at where this legislation started, there are two really important routes for why we started making these laws. And the first one is that kind of fraud that we just talked about, those patent medicines, the elixirs and tonics that people would create and sell that wouldn't do what they said they were going to do, or would end up being dangerous in and of themselves. And then our second category has to do with morality and race. And this is typically where we start talking about drugs that we now categorize as drugs of abuse. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dig into particular drugs and laws. We're going to be looking at three major pieces of legislation that still affect how we handle our drug regulation here in the United States in the 21st century. The first one is the Pure Food and Drugs Act, which was passed in 1906, the 1914 Harrison Act, and then we'll also spend some time talking about the 18th Amendment, which of course started the period we know as Prohibition, during which the manufacturing, transportation, sale, and use of alcohol was illegal here in the United States. So we're talking about how we started legislating here in the United States. You can see the image here on the screen was for toothache drops, apparently appropriate for children, that contain cocaine. And this was legal for sale. They were manufactured. They probably did a really good job handling that pain. And of course, it's something that we now think about as inappropriate and very, very dangerous. But at the time, you could find this in your local drugstore. So this is one of the issues that people were concerned about when we talk about those patent medicines, those drugs that were created and sold without any regulation, these would be habit forming. Consuming cocaine in this form could be just as dependence-inducing as some of the other methods of consuming cocaine. So that was definitely a problem. And then, of course, those false therapeutic claims. That concoction you cooked up in your backyard probably didn't actually help with people's headaches. So those two types of fraud, false therapeutic claims and then content that was actually habit-forming, were two things that caused a lot of public uproar at the time that these laws started to be created. So one of the first drugs that became illicit here in the United States, one of the first drug laws that we see passed against drug use, many of these laws had to do with the use of opium. If we think back to historical trends at the time, there was a large influx of Chinese immigrants to the United States around this time period. And opium smoking was a cultural habit that came along with them. Now, this was not something that was considered illegal at the time in the United States. But we'll see this trend that we'll repeat several times as we talk about different illicit drugs here in the U.S., where cultural concerns about the presence of the immigrants was translated into the legislating against the use of a substance that was thought to be common among that population. So we see laws passed against importing, manufacturing, and using opium. And really what we're looking at is the legal representation of a cultural concern. We couldn't outlaw being Chinese or being an immigrant, but we could outlaw this behavior that was strongly associated with Chinese immigrants at the time. And again, we'll see this pattern repeat as we talk about several of our illicit drugs throughout this class. The next one that we saw a cultural trend towards outlawing was cocaine. Now again, this was present in pharmaceutical products. It was a common thing at the time and probably, again, highly effective. So we saw it present in patent medicines and then also in substances that were consumed for widely throughout the culture. This is coca wine. So this was a beverage that contained some concentration of cocaine in it. And the urban legend is true. Coca-Cola, in its original formulation, also had a trace of cocaine in it as well. So this was, again, something that was widely available. There was not a real strong cultural prejudice against it, but at a certain time in our history, it became associated with use by African Americans. There were news stories, very sensational and not all true, about crimes that were committed by African Americans who were consuming cocaine at the time. So if you think back again to race relations here in the United States in the 1800s, we couldn't outlaw being African American. We'd taken care of that one during the Civil War. We couldn't outlaw the actual presence of the people in society, so what we ended up outlawing was a behavior that was associated with this population. So we see laws against the use and manufacturing of cocaine starting to become prevalent during this time period. And if you just take a quick look at the fine print of that advertising there, if you had a professional card and you were a doctor or a clergyman at the time, then you could get a free sample bottle of the coca wine. So again, no real strong cultural prejudice against the substance itself, and really only started to become outlawed when it became associated with this population that faced racism and prejudice in our society. Okay, so that's our summary of some of our early attempts to make certain drugs illicit here in the United States through legal action. When we look at legal action on the federal level, one of the first bills that we see is the Pure Food and Drug Acts of 1906. So this was actually about those patent medicines that we discussed. And the goal of the legislation was to make sure that anything that was sold as a drug was pure, it didn't contain any contaminants that were dangerous to health, and they were honestly labeled. If it said that it was going to relieve your headache, you had some confidence that that's what it would actually do. And the jurisdiction for this type of enforcement was through the Department of Agriculture. Now, one of the first efforts we see at the federal level, we saw those laws for against opium use and cocaine use start at the local level, work their way up to the state level, and then finally at the federal level, in 1914, we see the Harrison Act. So the first effort of the federal government is not to make the drugs illegal, but it's actually to get a piece of the pie. So the Harrison Act actually affected behavior by the Treasury Department, and its purpose was to start taxing drugs like opium and cocaine, and to limit the people who could prescribe them and manufacture them to people who would then pay taxes on them. So their goal there is to tax those drugs and to restrict commerce in opioids and cocaine to folks who are manufactured, who were authorized rather, and then also taxed for their participation in that industry. So that's the Harrison Act, our first federal effort. And note again, it does not make the drug use illegal, it just starts to tax the behavior. So a little bit more about the Pure Food and Drug Acts. The purpose here is, again, because it's federal government and has limited powers, so its first effort is to prohibit interstate commerce. Interstate commerce is one of the powers that's reserved to the federal government, regulation of interstate commerce in the Constitution. So if you were going to create one of those backyard elixirs or tonics, and it was either adulterated, it had contaminants in it, or you were saying that it did things that it didn't do, then you couldn't take that across state lines to sell it. Now, the misbranding, saying that it did things that it didn't, this really only applies to the labeling, not yet to advertising. At this point in the history of our country, we're not really regulating advertising at all. So you could say out loud that your cocoa wine did lots and lots of things, but on the label, you could only say things that you knew were true. Okay, and as we move through the 20th century, we'll see amendments because we still basically work with, we still consume drugs that are regulated by this act. We'll see amendments that apply to whether or not the medication is safe and whether or not it is also effective. Okay, so this is the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act.